Welcome to Holding Up the Ladder, a podcast and media content platform focused on curating spaces for creatives to be inspired. Our aim is to build a database of knowledge to ensure that we're not always learning the same things over and over again, supporting each other and holding up the ladder rather than pulling it up from under us as we climb. My name is Matt Sadiso. I'm a musician, songwriter, composer, producer and teacher. We have a very special filmed episode of the podcast today with multi-disciplinary artist Sasha Huber. Sasha's exhibition, You Name It, at London's Autograph brings together a decade's worth of work, prompted by the campaign Demounting Louis Agassiz. Sasha is also part of Autograph's commissioning project Amplify, Stranger in the Village, Afro European Matters, with a new work in her series, The First's, Tilo Frey, commemorating the Swiss-Cameroonian politician who campaigned for women's rights and suffrage in Switzerland. But before we jump in, I want to tell you how we met. Sasha listens to the podcast and got in touch via Instagram. We've stayed connected, and when she very kindly invited me to the opening of her exhibition, I suggested I interview her. We talk about Sasha's practice, how art, to quote Sasha, allows her to renegotiate history. We talk about Sasha's use of staple guns in her practice, how Sasha's art has become part of a collective and collaborative tool for reparative justice, and what happens to art beyond exhibition. Where does it go? Who gets to benefit from it? Sasha Huber, thank you so much for being here with me today. Your work is beautiful. It's so exciting to see it in person. I want to frame our discussion, if you like, today on the politics of memory. I feel like this idea of every time I've been reading through your work and your practice, I keep thinking, who do we remember? Why do we remember them, and how do we remember them? You say that art allows you to renegotiate history, which I love. So perhaps talk to me a little bit about this process of how we remember and why you anchor your work in that sort of thought process, if you like.
Yeah, so for me it came first in a way about remembering within the family context. So it's kind of more of a micro-history wise, where I was always interested. And I was also very interested in my mother's heritage. She's from Haiti, and it's a place I only been once as a child, and was then kind of drawn to the history, especially because I was not allowed to go there because of the political, although because it was dangerous, which is justified, of course, also. But I think that was for me a starting point to start to think about history, who has written this history, and what does it mean, or who else has experienced other points of view that were not necessarily written down, because things that are not written down doesn't mean that they didn't not happen, and so on. And but in the context of this body of work, I started 2008 in response to being invited to join the cultural activist campaign called Demounting Louis Agassiz. It was for me the start to become more active, like, action. The action means like also step out. For me, it was like stepping out of the studio space and also start to work more collaboratively. And then it became like an ongoing conversation, and I learned so much, especially through the people I got to know in the process of working about the Demounting Louis Agassiz.
Well, let's talk about Louis Agassiz, because I'd never heard of him, and honestly fascinating. I guess a glaciologist, zoologist, but over 80 places in the world are named after him, including one on Mars and on the Moon and on Earth, and also 7 species. But he was basically a eugenicist, scientific racist, and I just found the way you were almost renaming and denaming, his work and this sort of how we celebrate people and how we remember them, and we sort of omit massive parts of how they do things and why they do things. So let's talk about the mountain, Agassiz Horn, and how it became Renty Horn, because I think that's amazing.
Yeah, so I have to step a little bit back, because my sister, she gifted me a book about Swiss involvement in slavery and the slave trade. Mm-hmm. And this book was written by the historian activist called Hans Fässler. Mm-hmm. And that was in 2006. I read it. It was published 2005. And these are all things that I didn't know about. What's the colonial history of Switzerland being not a colony as such, but having colonists that did business that enrich the country. This was all history I wasn't aware of in that sense. And it made me want to know more. And that's why I contacted Hans, and we met in 2006, and that's when it started to learn about what his initiatives are. And by 2007, he founded this Demounting Louis Agassiz campaign, because it was the 200-year anniversary of Agassiz's death that was celebrated in exhibitions. And Hans noticed that only the merits relating to the glaciology were kind of highlighted. But when he moved to the States in 1846 to guide lecture series, and he ended up staying in the States, this is where he started to develop in becoming one of the most influential racists of the 19th century. And that part was completely left out in that history telling. And that was the initial idea of suggesting this renaming of one of the mountains named after Agassiz, that he named himself actually at the time when he was not even so known yet. With his colleagues, they were venturing the area there, which is nowadays a UNESCO World Nature Heritage Site, to rename it after Renty, Renty Horn. And Renty was a Congolese enslaved man who was on a plantation in South Carolina alongside his daughter Delia and 5 other individuals. And he commissioned a photographer, Joseph Zeli, to photograph this group of enslaved people, but then naked. And that has never happened before, that people were photographed in this way. And the idea was to honor Renty and people who experience similar fates. And that's the moment when I started to think, okay, what could I do? And I felt I want to go rename the mountain, like physically. So it was symbolically, but it was physical renaming. And I talked about this idea with Hans, and he supported me from the very beginning, and became also like my historian and like advisor, historical advisor over the years. So this is like a collaborative endeavor. But within the art context, it was really, for me, the way of how I want to speak about this issue. And as part of the intervention, which to the mountain, I was filming this and got it photographed. I also started a petition website, which allowed people from wherever to give their name if they would support this idea, and leave also a note. So this website is still online, and it became like an archive of its own in a way. There's about 3,000 signatures over there from over 70 countries around the world. So, and then I wrote a letter of request that was sent to the 3 mayors, because the mountain is located on a border to 2 cantons and 3 communes, so all of them would have had to say yes. And so they got that letter. In a way, they knew already of the campaign, because that was 2007. And when I did the intervention, it was a year later, so they were already aware of it. And also the UNESCO World Nature Heritage people, committee members, and Kofi Annan was in the committee at the moment then, and we thought maybe he understands what this is about. But I did get a letter from the foundation foundation saying thank you for this endeavor and good luck for this. But it was, the idea was basically to start the conversation about it, and since then we made about 4 attempts and to rename it, because it was always, they said always no, and the last attempt was in 2020 because of the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and many years later felt, okay, maybe there has happened a change, a rethinking of the situation, the understanding of what would it mean if such a renaming would take place, and unfortunately they still said no.
Do they say why they say no?
Well, one of the reasons is that most mountains, or all mountains, never have names of people. Yeah. So they didn't feel it's a good idea to rename it in another person's name. That was one of the reasons. And the other reason was like, oh, it's been like that so long, and, well, not really long, but the merits relating to glaciology are valid and so on.
It's so interesting for me because I find, you know, these men of that era, or these people of that era, how they had the hubris to climb on a mountain and say, I'm going to name it after myself. They didn't ask for permission. They took some nature and they said, I'm going to name it after myself. But when it comes to, I guess, I would call it reparative justice, restorative justice, that you have to ask permission, I just feel like you just name it. You have this fantastic, I guess, plaque that says Rentihorn. I'm like, well, then that's what it's called. Because if they had the hubris to do it, why can you not? You know, who decides? You know what I mean? And I find, I just find it really interesting how the rules shift depending on agendas. So I find it really powerful what you're doing. But as far as I'm concerned, I think we get to name these things what we like. Do you know what I mean? But I think, of course, there's power in some a body like the UN or people in Switzerland acknowledging it as well. You know. But what I love is that you also did that. You were in New Zealand, and you had I think you called it a resetting ceremony with was it a glacier that was called the Agassiz Glacier, and it was renamed. You're going to have to tell me how to say this because I don't want to say it wrong, but it's the Maori names.
So the name of the glacier had no Maori name before. It was named after Agassiz, and it was at the time when the Crown came to Aotearoa, New Zealand. They sent Julius von Haast to venture the country to find natural resources like gold and so on. And during that journey, he named and renamed about 100 places after, you know, people like Agassiz himself, mostly European, mostly men, and so on. So, but since several years, there has been a movement to bring back those original names, and there is also a mountain range called Agassiz Range in the South Island. And because in the Rentihorn case, because I'm Swiss, I was able to do it myself. But of course, when I go to another place, it's not possible. So it was very important for me to collaborate with the Maori people from the area, and so that was then his offering to perform this karakia on the glacier to symbolically unname and cleanse it of its association to Agassiz. So it was, it didn't go through similarly to like in the Swiss case to contact the government and so on. But the Maori iwi, the tribe from the area, they said they would suggest, also they would welcome the idea to find appropriate Maori name for this particular places. But this has not happened. But it was still the reparativeness of this way of working came really very present there. So I also call this works reparative interventions.
Yes, which I love. And I think, Indigenous people understand that they're there to care for the earth. they don't name these things after themselves.
No,
That's why they don't have names, you know.
Ho kati mahaki te hapu. Ho pauteni kai tahu te iwi. Ti hei mauri ora. E tu ana ahoi. Ke laro. Iti tau mara mara. Ho taku mauka ariki. E titi nei ki te raki.
You also did it in where there was Lake Agassiz in the Algonquin First Nation people.
Oh yeah, yes.
And you it was called, you did a film which is here called Mother Throat, where you have throat singing. What I love about how you collaborate, first of all, which I love, but how you bring this, as you said, reparative intervention, is always in a way that mirrors the sort of values of the people that were there already, you know, so the throat singing or having this cleansing or, you know, I think it's so interesting. And I think, so I come from a legal background. I trained as a human rights lawyer, but I'm a musician. So I'm always thinking about how art and justice can marry. And I've seen through your practice how well you do that. And it's really inspiring. As Sasha walked me through her exhibition, which was such a privilege, intimately explaining her process and intention behind each piece, I understood that the methodology in her practice is never accidental. Her choice of materials don't have an aesthetic purpose, using paint or taking a photograph. Instead, they are central to Sasha's interventionist approach in redressing racist and colonial legacies. For example, using an acoustic soundboard for the autograph commissioned The First's Tilo Frey was to reflect this idea of a silenced voice. Sasha uses a staple gun. She calls them pain things. As she says, these staples symbolically stitch wounds together. Knots in the staples bowl known as monkey fists in sailing, this strange fruit bowl, pointing us to Billie Holiday's song of the same name, reminding us, as the writer James Baldwin wrote, that history is not the past, history is the present. In the somatological triptych of Sasha, a series of photographs taken around the world in locations named after Agassiz, in which Sasha stands naked in 3 separate positions, mirroring the way enslaved people were photographed to further Agassiz's eugenics campaign. And as I reflect on Sasha's work and this idea of the politics of memory, who, why, and how we remember, I wonder whether this deliberateness is a way of retelling, reframing, and re-remembering our stories. But I want to talk about your staple guns, because it was only when I looked closely that I realised that you staple these almost garments. I think you talk about like stitching wounds, but from afar, they look like armour to me. They look like noble robes. They're beautiful, beautiful. And I was like, oh my goodness, they're staple guns. So tell me about why you've chosen the staple gun embedded within your practice as a sort of, it's almost like an act of resistance, I'd say.
Yeah, it's exactly good how you say it, because this was the starting point. And I discovered this tool, this everyday life tool, basically, during my studies, my master's studies in Helsinki, which was graphic design. So my background is actually in graphic design.
Yeah.
And then I tested it out, and I realized immediately that, wow, it's a weapon. I mean, it's a staple gun, right? So but the weight is like a real gun. The sound, you have to protect your ears and eyes to while working. It's loud, and so I realized that it has a capacity to allow me to speak about issues that I'm concerned about. And it came together at a moment, at a time where I wanted to go to Haiti, and I wasn't allowed, so I ended up going later. But yeah, it just bothered me, and it made me study more about the reasons. Why is it like it is? Why is there this problem? And so I learned more about the history and so on. So I decided to actually use this kind of this tool to react to this unjust history. So that was the first portraiture series I made as a whole, which was called Shooting Back, Reflection on Haitian Roots. And so I portrayed, and using this tool as a way of shooting back, literally like portraying people like Christopher Columbus, who was like the first, that where the troubles started, basically. And then I portrayed also the dictators of Haiti. So that was how I started using the staple gun. But then I realized I'm creating these portraits of these men who've been written down in history, who have done so much harm. I don't want to use my energy in this way anymore. Because there happened this change of the methodology that I felt I want to tell stories and learn about stories of people and histories that were silenced in the past, or who were not written down in history. And so the stapling really changed to become like more of a stitching.
Yes.
And I started to call the works paintings.
Right.
You know, like there is a lot of paint. It goes under the skin, like under the surface as well. Yeah. And the portrait of Tilo Frey, for instance, is made onto an acoustic board as a way of discussing of how you use this material to mute sound in space, as a way of speaking about that. So because usually I work on wood. I actually asked where I ordered those staples, how many staples did I used so far, and they had the records till 2010. Only, not all the way back, but it was about 1 million, million staples. And one of my biggest works is 3.5 meters times 120, which is in as a shape of a ship. And I filled it with staples forming the ocean. And it's about commemorating people that didn't survive the Middle Passage. So it's symbolically commemorating these people, but also it relates to people that, nowadays don't survive there's this word, this which was coined, I don't know who invented the words, but the Mediterranean Middle Passage. So people are at the moment drowning, who are not supposed to have to, get into safety because they are, they have to want to have a life, and be safe. So that kind of connects to it. So it's more abstract way of working, not just portraiture. But portraiture is kind of was the starting point.
Autograph invited Sasha to create new work for their commissioning project, Amplify, Stranger in the Village, Afro European Matters. As part of the project, Sasha chose to create a portrait honouring the late artist Khadija Saye, entitled Khadija Saye, You Are Missed, an artist, activist and carer who died alongside her mother in the tragic Grenfell Tower fire in 2017 in West London.
And when I heard about the whole tragedy with over 70 people died and all, and then when I heard about Khadija's fate, then I just felt so... because I didn't know her personally, but I really felt like very connected and so devastated. How is this possible? And at the time, that was when it happened, and I've seen some of her work documented as part of the diaspora pavilion, which was in Venice, and so on. And then I immediately felt I would like to portray her. But I didn't have a context, so I didn't dare to portray her out of context or just do it, but I just had it in my back head. And then when I was invited for this commission, I immediately remembered her. And I don't know anything about the politics around it, but it was just my personal feeling was that I would like to portray her. And then I learned that she made her first not tintypes, but the ambrotypes here at Autograph and so on. So it felt like, in a way, the perfect place to have a portrait of her, where people knew her and her beginnings. And so I'm glad that I was able, that they agreed for me to do it. And I wished I would have known her, but now there is those record. There's also means also tells about the importance of the image, the photography, the documentation, the videos that exist, that you can kind of have a way of keeping it for the future also. So that's why I felt I want to portray her.
Well, let's talk about. I love this idea of bringing supposedly invisible people into visibility. And with this commission, the Autograph commission project that you're part of, Amplify, Stranger in the Village, Afro European Matters, with your new work in the series, the first, Tilo Frey. Before we do that, I want to read, because Stranger in the Village comes from the Baldwin chapter in Notes of a Native Son. But he said, people are trapped in history and history is trapped in them. And I thought, gosh, yeah. But then he says this, I say that Baldwin spent some time in Switzerland, and he's actually part of the first series. He was in a place called Lucabad in the Valais Alps in Switzerland. So in this chapter, he's talking about what it was like being a stranger in this village. And he says, I say that the culture of these people controls me, but they can scarcely be held responsible for European culture. America comes out of Europe, but these people have never seen America, nor have most of them seen more of Europe than the hamlet at the foot of their mountain. Yet they move with an authority which I shall never have, and they regard me quite rightly not only as a stranger in their village, but as a suspect, latecomer, bearing no credentials to everything they have, however unconsciously inherited. And so, I mean, Baldwin always just has a way with words, but you've taken this woman, Tilo Frey, that's part of this commission series by Autograph. And she, again, I'd not heard of her before. She was a Cameroonian Swiss pioneering political activist who campaigned for women's rights and suffrage in Switzerland, where women were only given the vote in 1971, which just blows my mind. As a comparative, UK suffrage was 1928, so there's a massive difference. And you have this beautiful music by Brandy Butler underneath. And again, and what I want you to talk about it, of course, but what I do love about this and this idea of renaming is that Tilo Frey spent time in
Neuchâtel. She's from there.
Yeah,
she was from there.
Neuchâtel.
Yeah.
Okay. Am I saying Neuchâtel? Am I saying it right?
Yeah, this French-speaking part.
Okay. And you renamed Espace Agassiz because it was actually Agassiz. It was called the Agassiz space or Espace Agassiz, and it's become Espace Tilo Frey.
Yes, exactly. But it was not our initiative, but I think our initiative helped probably to redress this history over there, because he was from Neuchâtel also. Yeah. And there was no, at the time, any commemoration for Tilo Frey. So the university and the city decided to rename it, and it went really fast. And there was nobody was much asking other opinions and so on, and it became like a very... There's certainly former rectors of the university were complaining, and it was quite harsh to follow. But this was in 2019, so this is the first place that was in Switzerland renamed, which was before called Agassiz. And Neuchâtel is also a city which was built on the, through the slave history, also the transatlantic slave trade, and there have been a family de Pury, or a colonist who brought a lot of wealth to Switzerland, which was made on the backs of enslaved people. So many people think Switzerland has nothing to do with the colonial history, but it's not the case. So you don't have to have colonies to be involved. And Hans' work is that he brings all those things to the surface, and he says also every surface you start to scratch, you will find something. So that's really important work.
Yes. So coming back to this, your choice. So she's part of, I think you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 of this series of the firsts. Mm-hmm. Why did you choose Tilo Frey? And perhaps maybe do you want to maybe tell me why you started with this idea of calling things the firsts anyway?
Yeah. Well, at the beginning, it was in 2017 where I learned about one of the first African persons in Finland. Yes. So I portrayed that person. Her name was Rosa Emilia Clay. Missionaries actually brought her as a child to Finland and wanted her to become a teacher and send her back. And she ended up stay in Finland, and then it was quite difficult for her. And throughout, because there was a strong racism against black bodies in Finland. Still today is one of the most racist countries in Europe, actually, officially. And she immigrated then to the States. And so I started the work with her portrait, and it is basically about people from the 19th and 20th century, from the African diaspora, who arrived in European countries, predominantly white societies, but then it's also about people from our times now who achieve certain goals, as being one of the first black persons. And I'm interested about the reasons why is it so late, and so on. So it's an ongoing series, and in 2017 was Afro European conference in Finland, and there was the researcher Jovita dos Santos Pintos, who made her master thesis about Tilo Frey. She was there talking about Tilo, and that was where I got to know about her story. And I, at that time, already felt I would be interested to make her portrait, but because I have a whole list of people that I would be interested to portray. And that was actually the moment where Paul Gilroy gave a keynote, and that's where we met. And
the academic Paul Gilroy.
Yes, who lives here, and he commissioned me to make a portrait of Sarah Raymond Parker for his Center for the Studies of Racism and Racialization at UCL, and I just this morning could meet him there again.
That's where I went to university, UCL.
Oh yeah, okay.
That's where I went.
So it's her portrait is now there next to his office, actually. So that was really amazing how this possibility came also.
And why did you choose to put music this time on? So you have this, I guess, a sort of visual that goes in and out, almost ghost-like. Mm-hmm. And then you have Brandy Butler's music over the top that's kind of haunting and also feels isolated and sort of, why did you choose, or why did you choose to do it that way?
Yeah, well, it came so that in 2019 I was in a residency in Rome. I was invited to go to Rome to make a work there, and previously I learned about Edmonia Lewis, who was a sculptor from the States, and she had she African American but with Haitian and indigenous roots, and she moved in 1866 to Rome to be artist, and I learned about her through the musician Melissa Lavoie. She's Afro-Canadian, but in France, and she's French also. So she was in Rome in a residency, and she wrote a song about Edmonia. And we have known each other already, but when I learned about Edmonia through Melissa, I felt it would be really nice to collaborate. And then I was invited to go to Rome to make something. Yeah. And then I could propose what I would like to do in this week at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Rome. And then I immediately thought about Edmonia. Mm-hmm. And that was when I wanted it to be filmed like as a kind of a stop motion, how the making of is also documented in this way because it's quite performative. Mm-hmm. The work, which I have done usually only by myself, so you only see the end result. And that was a place where I could test this out.
The tide, what was left untold, remained inside. Oh, time moves on. The wind whispers to the sea. When I am gone, please don't forget me. I'm a musician, but I have a background in human rights law, so I'm always thinking about social justice and in particular how and if the arts can really bring about social change. Can a song change the way we think about the world? Can a piece of art be a tool for justice? Well, maybe not by itself, but as Sasha shared her story about the Tailoring Freedom series, the ancestors of Renti and Delia Taylor, Tamara Lanier, and the descendants of the Agassiz family, I was so inspired by the power of collaboration and unified purpose, and that art can play a central role in restorative justice. We're at Autograph is part of its role is an archiving space. So what we should say about, so these daguerreotypes, the ancestors of Renti and Delia, they were given to the Harvard Peabody Museum.
Yeah, the son of Agassiz gifted it to the Peabody Museum, and it ended up in an attic.
Right.
And in 1975 it was found by chance and brought down because they are very small. The daguerreotypes are very small, so they opened them up and realized that they haven't been catalogued or seen before, and they are apparently the first photographs of enslaved people in the history as a whole. And it was in 2012 when Tamara Lanier, who's the descendant, she's 3 times great-granddaughter of Renti, emailed me and also Hans and introduced herself as the descendant of Renti. And this was amazing because we couldn't have something I couldn't anticipate to happen. And it was because she was saying that her daughters found the petition website that I made, where it explains the story. And so she said, you want to name this mountain after my ancestor, and I support this. And this is, and then she came to Switzerland 2012, when we, as a kind of a compromise, because the mountain was not renamed, could make an exhibition in Grindelwald, in a mountain village relatively near of the Rentihorn. And so she could speak there about Renti as a person. He could read, for instance, he taught his children, and he was keeping secret Bible circles and so on. So she was able to share what has been passed down to her about Renti, who was important for her family. And Hans at the time also invited the descendants of Agassiz, because they are there also, and they were not interested at all. And they actually said, "Oh, we want to sue you. We don't like how you distort." But the thing is, we don't distort. We just say things that were not talked about before. And in response to that, in 2019, not in response to that, but just to fast forward, by 2019, Tamara, after not being given the copyright or to use the photographs of her ancestors.
So I know that the case, Harvard Tamara Lanier took it to court, and
in 2019, March 2019.
Right. And what I find really interesting about legal things is basically what they were saying in the court is that a subject of a photo has no legal copyright, like ownership of the photo. And because she is a descendant, neither does she. And so you can have a legal idea that makes sense legally, but morally just doesn't make any sense. And so I was thinking about it in terms of, so I did human rights law, and it comes back to Switzerland, which I find very interesting because, you know, the United Nations is in Switzerland and we often think of Switzerland as a neutral country. But actually, I was listening to a fantastic podcast called Kif Taras, which is a French podcast, and they were talking about Switzerland's sort of denial of its colonial history, but that actually they have used Switzerland's neutrality as kind of like a political and economic strategy. Look, oh, come, we're in the middle and we'll negotiate everything for you kind of thing. So you have the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. And the idea with human rights is that all that the law does is put on paper stuff that we already know to be true about human beings, that all human beings are inherently have inherent dignity and equal value. That's what the first article of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. There is a moral, even if in law nobody owns these photographs and the subject doesn't own it, there is a moral imperative to just give these things to the ancestors. I don't even understand why anybody's even arguing about this. So I just wanted to get that off my chest because I've been thinking about that, but I'd be interested to know what you think about it. And I know that they've appealed it, but I don't know what's happened. I couldn't find what's happened after that.
Yeah, so I could maybe also share that I've been in contact with Tamara over the years, and maybe it's also interesting to know that she was offered to be by the attorneys to make it a case because it's very expensive. Yeah. You see, so they make that for free for her. Benjamin Crump he was the lawyer of George Floyd's family. As he makes this, and Martin Brown, Michael Brown, sorry, and really,
by police, right?
Yes, and so he is like a civil rights lawyer, attorney. So he said that we want to help you. So this is how it was possible for her to actually do this, and yeah. So when it was when she did it, it was also in the whole press. Of course, because it was never done before, and then it was, not accepted. But then it went to the Supreme Court, Massachusetts Supreme Court, and now in October, I think it was, they also said no to her again. So she cannot have those photographs, but they could. She can sue Harvard in relation to the distress that it caused to her. This whole story. So and she will continue. She just told me the other day she doesn't give up. And what is interesting is that she was contacted by the 3 times great-granddaughter of Agassiz, of his family in the States. Also, because he started a new family when he moved here, and she read about it in the New York Times. It was on the cover even, and she felt. They don't want to ignore this now. They have to take a stand, and they contacted Tamara to ask if they could support her in any way, and so on. Good. So they wrote a letter, open letter, to the director of Harvard University and the board, and 41 descendants of Agassiz signed that letter, and. That was in 2019 when they published that. And my partner Petri, who's been working with me a lot, who's an artist of his own as well, he was there and he filmed the whole press conference, which is also in the exhibition under the title Picturing a Reparation.
Slavery, and just as important, the justification of slavery offered by Professor Agassiz and Harvard University. So today, we offer a new path forward at these Howler Halls here in Cambridge, Massachusetts. A new path forward where the linear descendants of Agassiz and Renty, the children of slaves and slave masters, coming together to try to offer a better world to our children.
So it's really interesting that has not happened before, that you have this the two families come together.
That's powerful.
Yes, and so that is also something that I couldn't have anticipated, that this would be coming part of this whole and collective work. You know, it's not, I didn't do this alone well. So yeah, this has kind of gotten a new history of its own, her own story, and she also will write that story herself in working on that already. And so for me also, because you asked me before, what do I think about the photographs? I also see them as that they are owned by the institution and they represent the people. And they are not the picture, you know, that's the moral idea, also what you were saying before. So for me, that's what it means, that symbolically they should get out of the institution, that they cannot be owned and sold, you know, the copyrights sold and so on, these things. And that's also then how I revisited the idea of, because in 2008 I made a drawing of Renty dressed in traditional African, also Congolese clothes. Because I felt I could kind of assume how it must have been humiliating to have to undress in front of strangers and just stand there, and you know, that time you have to hold still to be photographed. You don't see immediately what's in that box, you know, what's happening, and they probably never seen these images that were made of them. But I just felt I wanted to do this drawing. And then now, with the whole story for Tamara, I felt I would like to revisit those photographs and start to clothe them as a way of thinking of their freedom. And that was also the first time where I married the stapling with photography. So I reproduced the photographs, enlarged, of course, onto wood. And then I stapled clothing onto them, and the clothes are inspired. Also, Renty's suit is inspired by a suit I saw from a photograph, one of the many photographs of Frederick Douglass, as a way of imagining the freedom for Renty. And the dress of Delia was inspired by Harriet Tubman's dress of a photograph that I found of her to imagine how it would have been for them to also be free, something that we would have wished for them to happen. And then it was important for me to also remember the other 5 individuals who were photographed as well at the same time, who don't have the luck to have descendants, you know, in our times now to fight for their freedom in a way. So that was very important to extend that series as a whole. And this is now here for the first time visible all together.
Because I'm passionate about sharing knowledge, in every podcast episode, I always ask my guests to share a lesson that they have learned that we can learn from. And because I'm a musician, no matter their creative discipline, we always talk about music. I was reading an article by Ariella Azule about all of this, and she talked about an imperial archival technology of violence. And I feel like what you're doing with this work and with all these other people that you collaborate with and Tamara's family is this sort of reversal. It's taking ownership of it's sort of, and it's not a request, it's a demand. It's like, we don't need permission to do this. This is what we're doing. And there's so much power, and using art to do that, I find so inspiring. Which leads me on to the question I always ask people. in the context of everything we've spoken about, and you as an artist, what lessons have you learned that you think we can learn from? I'm sure there are many, but are there like one or two that really stick out to you that you think this is something, this sort of 10-year process of exploration that started with me, you know, started with your family. Where do you find yourself now, you know?
Maybe before I say this, I know time runs quickly, but to kind of connect still to the tailoring freedom is that I also made the portrait of Renti and Delia for Tamara. It's a gift. So at the end, it goes to her. It also was for me important to do it for her. As a way, and that was before we knew what's the outcome of the case and so on, if she would be able to get those images or not. But that is also what I'm often thinking, what in the art, you know, this is another topic, more to say, but what happens with work that is shown, what happens to it after, where does it belong or where should it not go, and so on. So in this particular case of those two portraits, it was very important that they will be hers and that they can be seen, and her story of her ancestors, how they were as humans, you know, because that's what they were, but that was denied from them. And her reaction was also beautiful because she said that I was able to take them out of their circumstances through this, you know, attire, and she felt it was like a Sunday's best, you know, and for Renti and for Delia it was like a wedding dress almost, or something like that. So it gives the dignity somehow back symbolically. But the lessons learned, exactly. That's always I was always thinking that's a really nice way of ending and unleashing again further longer conversations as well. But over the years, I just lessons learned in ways that not give up and be have a kind of a grit or being persistent and just carry on and not just, or don't take no for an answer as well. That is something that kind of naturally come to the surface, that when you keep on doing what you believe in, then things will happen that make you feel like, okay, this is the right thing. Also, like for instance, being contacted by Tamara, that was a symbol, a sign like that, and one, or it's like little miracles somehow, and I think those things happen when one also listens to the intuition and you know, don't necessarily think about what will that mean for the future or something. It's just like being work intuitive. That has been for me really kind of bringing me from one thing to the other. And in a way, I also always say that at the beginning when I started to work with the staples, it was for me like a seed that I planted, of which and slowly this plant would grow, and then it would branch out to do other things. So yeah, the lesson learned is kind of to keep on putting water on that plant, and then it can grow.
Fantastic. And you know, I think of plants. I think when we plant something, it becomes something that other people can also draw from. You know, a plant, then there are more seeds from that plant. Birds are in that, bees, and all of these things. There's something that builds and is part of a much larger ecosystem that's really beautiful. But my final question, as you know,
I know.
What music are you listening to?
Exactly. Yeah, the music was. Well, I listen. I love different jazz. I love soul music. I love all kinds of music. Also, classical music. I used to play the piano. Unfortunately, I stopped at some point. Then there is my good friend of mine, Sofia Mitiko. She's a musician in Helsinki. I really love knowing the musicians too and following their music. And she just she's about to publish her first record. And when I saw her a year ago, I was like blown away, you know, being in a space where, you know, the music happens. That is the best live music. I mean, you know, so that's the best, to be there and experience that and feel something. And
Fantastic.
yeah, so yeah.
Thank you so much. I've loved this.
Thank you so much.
Sasha Huber, thank you for your time, for sharing your practice, your generosity in sharing your practice. You Name It is on until March 2023. You must go and see it.
And there's a book.
Yes, there's a book out as well.
Fresh from the press.
Yes.
Bringing it all together with amazing writers. I'm like, yeah, it is sinking in still, so to say. Yeah.
Well, you kept going, and this is the fruit that you kept going.
Yes, exactly.
You know?
That's
It's
right.
good.
And it can be shared,
Exactly.
which is really good, and stays. We can, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That brings us to the close of this special filmed episode of Holding Up the Ladder. Thank you so much to Sasha Huber. Her exhibition will be on at London's Autograph until the 25th of March 2023. Do make sure you visit, it's a must-see. Sasha also has an accompanying book, You Name It. Both a book and an exhibition catalogue. Links for online purchase are available on the Holding Up the Ladder website, holdinguptheladder.com, and in the comments section below. Do also visit Sasha's website to learn more about her practice at sashahuber.com. Sasha's links, along with articles to some of the issues we discussed, can be found in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, subscribe, and leave a review. It really helps us to reach more people and grow the show. Visit our website to listen to previous podcast episodes, and you can also follow us on Instagram at Holding Up the Ladder and Twitter at HUTL_. Many thanks to Autograph for their collaboration on this episode. Until next time.
The land it grew, and the stories told of distant views. Oh, time moves on. The land whispers to the sun.